என்சைக்ளோபீடியா ஆஃப் ரிலீஜியனுக்கு அந்த ஆரியன் ரிலீஜனை பற்றி அந்த ஆர்டிக்கலை இன்றைக்கி டிஸ்கஸ் பண்ண போகிறோம். ஓகே ஃப்ரெண்ட்ஸ், நம்ம இன்னைக்கு ஷ்ரேடரோட ஆரியன் ரிலீஜன் பார்க்கலாம். ஸோ ஷ்ரேடர் எழுதின இன்னொரு புக்கை நம்ம வாசிச்சுக்கிட்டு இருந்தோம். அது என்ன அப்படின்னா ப்ரீஹிஸ்டாரிக் ஆன்டிக்விட்டீஸ் ஆஃப் ஆரியன் பீப்புள்ஸ் அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு புக்கை படிச்சுக்கிட்டு இருந்தோம். அந்த புக்கு படிச்சுக்கிட்டு இருக்கும்போது நான் அவரை பற்றின ஒரு பேக்ரவுண்ட் சர்ச் பண்ணிக்கிட்டு இருக்கும்போது இந்த ஆர்டிக்கல் பார்த்தேன். ஆரியன் ரிலீஜன் அப்படின்னு அதோட ஒரு சுருக்கத்தை ஒட்டுமொத்த இண்டோ யூரோப்பியன் பீப்புளோட ரிலீஜனை தான் அவர் ஆக்சுவலாக ஆரியன் ரிலீஜன்னு குறிப்பிடுறாரு. அதை பற்றின ஒரு ஷார்ட் இன்ட்ரொடக்ஷன் கொடுத்துருந்தாரு. ஒரு என்சைக்ளோபீடியா, ஜேம்ஸ் ஹேஸ்டிங்ஸோட என்சைக்ளோபீடியா ஆஃப் ரிலீஜியன் அண்ட் எத்திக்ஸ் அப்படிங்கிற இந்த புக்கு 1903 வந்திருக்கு. இந்த புக்கோட செகண்ட் வால்யூமில் ஆரியன் ரிலீஜன் அப்படிங்கிற டாப்பிக்கில் இவர் ஒரு ஆர்டிக்கல் எழுதியிருக்காரு. ஸோ அந்த ஆர்டிக்கலை இப்போ எடுத்துக்கலாம் அப்படின்னு நான் நினைக்கிறேன். அதை ஒரு வாட்டி ரன் த்ரூ ரீட் பண்ணலாம் அப்படின்னு நினைக்கிறேன். ஸோ நம்ம அதை என் கூட வாசிங்க கொஞ்சம் கொஞ்சமாக அப்படி. அதுக்கப்புறமா தென் வி வில் கோ த்ரூ ஒன்ஸ் ஒரு ரன் த்ரூ பண்ணினதுக்கப்புறமா தென் வி வில் ஸ்லோலி ரீட் ஈச் அண்ட் எவ்ரி போர்ஷன். Introduction. History. When A. Kuhn in the year 1845 published his famous treatise Zur Altesten Geschichte der Indo-Germanic Völker, by which he gave the first impulse towards an Aryan, that is, Indo-Germanic archaeology, he held out at the close of it the prospect of further investigations. So, quote, "There is still abundance of material available for comparison, for there is the whole province of religion, which promises abundant results and gives at the same time, from the intellectual side, the necessary complement of the picture we have sketched. If we have had occasion more than once in these pages to reach conclusions by means of the language of the Vedas, this will happen more frequently when we are considering the myths and religion of these writings in relation to those of other races." Kuhn's scientific work during the remainder of his life was almost exclusively devoted to proving the truth of these words. Along with him, we have found Max Muller with the same goal in view and setting out from the same starting point, the Rig Veda, on which he was one of the best authorities. These two scholars may be called the real founders of a comparative Aryan mythology, in which the notion of Aryan religion had for a long time been taking shape. The common point of view which they hold lies in the conviction, already aroused by the brothers Grimm, that mythology as well as language is rooted in the heart of the people, and that it is not the creation of the higher ranks, such as the priestly or the poetic order, a theory which Father Kreuzer had tried to prove at the beginning of the century in his work Symbolic. Its explanation is to be sought exclusively in nature and its phenomena, especially in the idea of a struggle, such as the spectacle of a thunderstorm or the alternation of day and night presents to us. This naturalistic view of mythology is exhibited most clearly in the poems of the Rig Veda, from which we can easily understand how the myths of the allied peoples were formed, and by means of which we are enabled to discover old Aryan myth cycles. This A. Kun has attempted to do in his articles on Gandharvan and Kentaren. Kunstgeschrift. Sharanyu, Manus, Minos, Manos, Hermos, Sarama, கெர்மோசன் நினைக்கிறேன் அது கிரீக். சரமா, சாரமேயா, ஓதான், etc. in ZDA 6, and especially in his great work Über die Herabkunft des Feuers und des Göttertranks. Max Muller, whose contributions to the science of comparative mythology, collected in 2 volumes in 1897, lectures on the science of language, along with the essays and chips from the German workshop, Origin and Growth of Religion, Biographies of Words, etc., are well known throughout the whole learned world, went even further than Kuhn in naturalistic explanation of mythical names. Especially characteristic of the views of both scholars, the fact may be mentioned that they were not content with discovering old Aryan myths, but tried also to deduce their origin from the character of human speech, its capacity for poetic interpretation, its polynomy and homonymy, etc. Such is, in very condensed form, the conception of mythology and religion held by Kuhn and Muller, for the full characterization of which we should have to note also the meager attention given in the works of both scholars to the important sphere of religious ceremonies or worship. This conception continued to be the prevailing one down to the 80s of last century, although from an early period, currents were perceptible which, issuing from various departments of science, seemed to threaten the foundations of the Kuhn-Muller theory. While this theory, in its reconstruction of the Aryan religion, started mainly from the oldest literary remains of the Aryan races, first of all the Veda and then the Avesta, Homer and the Edda. On the other hand, the science which has become known under the title of folklore and which has as its aim the collecting of the legends, fairy tales, customs and habits still prevalent among the people, directed attention to the form of the so-called lower mythology and sought to prove that the very oldest material is to be found in analogies such as those of the Greek dryads with the German moss and wood maidens, of the cyclops and centaurs with the wild men, etc. It was held to be demonstrable that many exalted divine and heroic figures originated in these circles. The most successful representative of this view was Mannhardt in his two chief works, Der Baumkultus der Germanen und ihrer Nachbarstem, and Antike Wald und Feldkulte aus Nordeuropäischer Überlieferung erläutert. Then, in addition to this, the study of ethnology and in its train, universal comparative history of religion pointed to a series of apparently primitive universal religious ideas among mankind, of which at least traces were found also among the Aryan races. and which did not seem to fit well into the system conceived by Kuhn and Muller. The ancestor theory, especially according to which all religions spring from the worship of the dead, was placed in the foreground from the anthropological side and was applied to the Aryan races by Lippert in De Religionen der Europa Ischen Culture Walker, der Literature, Slaven, Germanen, Grecian and Romer in Ihrem Geschichtlichen Ursprung, and in England by Herbert Spencer in his Principles of Sociology, followed by Allen in Evolution of the Idea of God. Similarly, Elad Hugo Meyer in his Indo-Germanische Mythen distinguished three chief periods in the formation of myths: belief in souls, in spirits, and gods. The first of which he designated pre-Aryan, the second Aryan, and the third post-Aryan. Moreover, even the opinion that the poems of the Rig Veda, from which, as we saw, the adherents of the Kuhn-Muller theory started, especially with regard to their interpretation of myths, introduce us directly to the domain of naive nature poetry, began to waver. And there were many acute interpreters who claimed to discover in the very oldest parts of the Veda traces of decay and of priestly refinement. This objection to the Kuhn-Muller explanation of myths has been urged with special force by O. Gruppe in his book Die Griechisch Cult and Mythien in Ihren Beziehungen zu den Orientreligionen, and in England by Lang in Custom and Myth, Myth, Ritual and Religion, and Modern Mythology. Gruppe points out that a great many of the mythical figures of the Rig Veda are explicable not by natural phenomena and occurrences, but by certain priestly manipulations of the cultus. He himself believes the Aryans of primitive times to have been completely devoid of religion and ascribes the uniformity of their myths and worship almost in the same way as Krebser to the enormous number of religious forms that they borrowed from Western Asia and Egypt and transferred to Greece, India, and Middle and North Europe. Finally, at the end of the 70s, comparative philology, whose daughter the comparative mythology of the Aryan people might well be claimed to be, had also entered upon a new phase of its development, inasmuch as from that time onwards the demand for a regular system in the correspondence of sounds as the result of etymological comparisons of words and forms was more emphatically insisted on. Naturally, this claim was made also in the sphere of identifications proposed by the students of the history of religions, and it became evident that the great majority of these identifications, and among them many which had hitherto been regarded as the most reliable supports of mythico-historical hypothesis, were phonetically untenable. Example: Sanskrit Gandharva, Greek Kentaros, Gandharvan and Kentaran. Sanskrit Marutas, the Maruts, equivalent to Latin Mars. Sanskrit Varuna, equivalent to Greek Auranos. Sanskrit Manu, equivalent to Greek Minos, and many others. MacDonnell, in his Vedic mythology, in Buhler's Grundriss der Indo-Arischen Philology and Alter Tumskunde. Under these circumstances, it is not to be wondered at the doubt of the correctness of the Kuhn-Muller interpretation of mythology increased from year to year, and that finally people actually arrived at such a degree of skepticism as to affirm that it was impossible to ascertain with certainty anything whatever about the oldest religious ideas and customs of the Aryans. Zupitza in the Zeitschrift des Variants for Volkskunde. It is only quite lately, example Winternitz in a series of admirable articles on Was Wissen wer Wander Indo-Germanen in Beilage zur Münchner AZ, that people are beginning to ask if it is necessary and just to pronounce the life work of such distinguished investigators as Kuhn and Max Muller absolutely null and void, and are attempting to rescue at least some of their results. All this enables us to see how hard it is at the present moment to give a summary of our knowledge of the Aryan religion. And before we even begin this difficult undertaking, it will be necessary, first of all, to touch on the most important points regarding the method which we ought to follow in the subsequent discussion. Method. In a thoughtful address entitled Die Aufgabe der theologischen Fakultäten an die Allgemeine Religionsgeschichte, Harnack says, quote, in the first place, it needs but little consideration to recognize that the study of each single religion ought by no means to be separated from the study of the history of the people concerned. To try to study the religion alone is a more childish undertaking than to examine only the roots or the blossom instead of the whole plant. End of quote. On account of this indissoluble connection between the history, or more accurately, the history of the culture of a race and its religion, which will often meet us in the following discussion, it goes without saying that the materials which furnish us with a knowledge of the culture of the primitive Aryans are in reality the same as those which make possible for us an acquaintance with their religion. As the present writer has recently treated the former in detail in the preface to his Realeksch des Indo-German Altertumskunde and in third edition of his other work, it only remains for him to characterize it shortly here in its special application to the history of religion. The materials which are at our disposal for the investigation of prehistoric periods of culture are derived partly from language, partly from things. With regard to the former, we must, first of all, with very strict regard to phonetic laws, compare the prehistoric equivalents discovered in the history of religion. For example, there exists beyond all doubt an equivalence of this kind in the group of words Sanskrit Deva, Latin Deus, Lithuanian Daivas, Irish Dia, Old Norse Tiver, that is God. And Max Muller is certainly right when, at different times, he has reckoned the establishment of an etymology of this kind among the most important achievements in the mental history of mankind. In this search for the primitive vocabulary, we must, of course, exclude equivalents that are confined to particular languages of the Aryan group, which we know were united to each other more closely than to the other languages. This holds example of a very considerable number of Indo-Iranian word correspondences like Sanskrit Soma, equivalent to Avesta Hauma for the Soma plant, which played so important a role in the cultures of both peoples. Sanskrit Mitra, equivalent to Avesta Mitra for the sun god Mitra. Sanskrit Hotar, equivalent to Avesta Zavatar for a certain class of priests, etc. We cannot utilize equivalents like these for determining the character of the Aryan religion. On the contrary, they simply demonstrate that the Indians completed the development of their religious history along with the Iranians, or perhaps only with the eastern branch of them, the consideration of which falls outside the scope of this article. Crossref on this point, Spiegel, De Arische Periode, Leipzig, 1887, and numerous sections in Oldenburg's book, Die Religion des Veda. Negative conclusions from the vocabulary of primitive times, that is, conclusions from the non-existence of an expression for a certain idea to the non-existence of that idea itself, are on the whole dangerous, as all negative deductions are. But it is otherwise when primitively related expressions are wanting for a whole class of ideas. When example, all attempts have failed to prove that real god names existed in the earliest times, or when there is no etymological agreement to be found between two languages for the idea of the temple, these facts will require due consideration in deciding the question whether there really were god names and temples in the primitive Aryan period. But it would be a great mistake to suppose that the only way in which philology can be of service to the history of religion is by placing at its disposal the primitive etymological equivalents in the sphere of religion. Harnack is right in saying that the history of religion is reflected in the history of language, and that only he who knows the latter is in a position to seek to decipher the former. In fact, the whole formation of religious ideas can be understood only with the help of philology. Whence came the god names of the separate Aryan races if, as we have just seen, they cannot be recognized in the vocabulary of the primitive language? What religious thought called them into being in each separate case, and how did this, their fundamental idea, afterwards grow deeper and wider? But even if it must unfortunately be admitted that our knowledge in this department is still very limited, the fact that at present we know nothing certain about the etymological explanation of many, indeed of most Aryan god names, an Indian Varuna and Mitra, a Greek Ares and Poseidon, a Roman Mars and Liber, the Teutonic Tanfana and Nerthus, and the Lithuanian Oxopirnus and Otrimpus, etc., does not justify the conclusion that this must remain so in the future. In this connection, Usiners Gotternamen versus Einer Lehere Wander Religiösen Begriffsbildung, a book which to some extent forms the basis of the present article, shows a marked advance, although the present writer recognizes this advance more in the fundamental idea of the work than in its details, which are often linguistically assailable. Moreover, what we really lack most in the sphere of Aryan archaeology, as in others, is a collection of linguistic material. Once we have before us collected and sifted the terminology of sacrifice and prayer, of priests and temples, of lots and consulting of oracles, of legal and moral ideas from all the Aryan languages, various stages of historical development emerge of their own accord, and each new etymological discovery implies a new discovery in the history of religion. We have so far been treating of expressions which either belong to the common prehistoric vocabulary or are autochthonous in the separate languages. Now we have to refer to another important source for the understanding of religious history. This is the foreign word or borrowing. Thus the Greek kadmos, taken from kedem, Hebrew kedem, the east, the Latin Apollo and Proserpina, from Greek Apollon, and Persephone, 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 and the Russian Bago, God, from Avesta Baga, show the directions from which new religious thoughts and suggestions came to the separate Aryan races. Now, even although the aid which is given to religious history by philology is great and many-sided, yet it is a great mistake to believe, as was formerly done, that the religion of the primitive Aryans, like their culture generally, could be deduced simply from etymological comparisons. It is true that the above mentioned equation, Sanskrit Deva, Latin Deus, shows us clearly that there were divine beings even in primitive times. But we cannot expect from philology any information regarding the intrinsic value or import and scope of this term. In this, as in all other questions, therefore, the comparison of things and the investigation of things must accompany the comparison of words. This brings us in the first place to prehistory or prehistoric archaeology, a science which in general is based in no small degree on certain religious consumptions and customs of prehistoric man. For we owe the majority of prehistoric relics, as is well known, to the ancient widespread practice of the worship of the dead, and the questions how and where the dead were buried, what was placed beside them in the way of food and drink, what weapons and implements were laid in the grave or on the funeral pyre, and why the corpse was buried in this or that position, turned in this or that direction, are naturally connected most closely with problems of the history of religion. But discoveries of another kind, such as sacrifice stones, idols, amulets, bronze kettles, bronze chariots, no doubt serving a religious purpose. One was found near Trondheim as recently as 1902. Refer Muller Urgeschichte Europas, Strasbourg 1904, page 116. and many others possess great significance in religious history, even if at first they raise more problems than they enable us to solve. But the chief task in this field of investigation must always be the comparison of the religions historically attested in the various Aryan races, and the attempt to select from the crowd of their heterogeneous phenomena what is common and original. And there can be no doubt concerning the path to be pursued, provided that the analogy emphasized above between the history of Aryan culture in general and the history of Aryan religion in particular is correct. It is the great merit of Hen to have shown, especially in his book Culture Pflanzen und Haustier in ihrem Übergang aus Asien nach Europa, that the conditions of civilization in primitive Aryan times have persisted, often with great faithfulness, among the North European races, particularly the Lithuanians and the Slavs, among whom they not infrequently show themselves at the present day. It is from the study of these races that the higher forms of life, as they are presented to us in Indian, Greek, and Roman antiquity, have for the first time been fully understood. There was really nothing further needed than the transference of this simple thought to the history of religion. In very much the same way, men like Smith and Curtis in primitive Semitic religion today have recently attempted to deduce the oldest Semitic religious conditions, not so much from Babylonian, Phoenician, Hebrew antiquity, as from their modern remains, especially among Arab tribes. Similarly, our task is to look at the higher forms of religion of the Indians, Greeks, and Romans from the standpoint of the lower stages of Northern European paganism, and to find the later again in the former. Unfortunately, this methodical plan is more easily stated than carried out. The reason for this is that our knowledge of Northern European religions is, in many ways, still shadowy and incomplete. ஓகே ஹியர் இது வரைக்கும் வந்து முடிஞ்சிருச்சு டெக்ஸ்ட்டு. ஸோ இந்த ரீடிங்கை சேவ் பண்ணி விட்டுருவோம். அதுக்கப்புறமா ரைட் நவ் த டைம் இஸ் 12:34. Friends, I will come back after finishing lunch at 2 p.m. 2 p.m. we will begin the digitization work. யாருக்காவது ஏதாவது கொஷின்ஸ் இருக்குன்னா 2 p.m. என்ன கொஷின்ஸ் கேளுங்க. கொஷின்ஸோட பிகின் பண்ணுவோம். யாருமே எந்த கொஷனும் இல்லை கேட்கல அப்படின்னா 2 p.m. I will begin digitizing the rest of the article. I'll be doing that on live. Thanks, friends.